Before we begin, please allow me to say a few words of thanks. Thank you so much for patiently listening all the way to this point. If these words have touched your heart, even just a little, please remember this small channel. Don't forget to hit like or subscribe, and we'll see each other again very soon. Now, let's begin today's story. The night I learned about my wife's betrayal did not arrive with thunder or shattered glass. It came quietly, disguised as an ordinary Tuesday. The kind of evening where the sink hummed with unfinished dishes and our daughter's homework lay half-colored on the dining table. Crayons rolling lazily under the chair legs like they had all the time in the world. And maybe that was the cruelest part of it, that the world refused to pause when my marriage quietly split in two. I remember standing in the hallway, my jacket still on, the smell of cold rain clinging to my sleeves, listening to my wife laugh softly in the bedroom. A laugh that no longer belonged to me. Warm, intimate, lowered just enough to be private. And in that moment something ancient and instinctive inside me knew the truth before my mind dared to name it. I did not burst through the door. Did not shout or demand explanations like men do in movies. Instead I leaned against the wall. Slid down until I was sitting on the floor. And waited for the laughter to end. Because when you are a father, you learn early that reactions have consequences. And some consequences echo in a child's life. For years her name was Emily. And for 10 years she had been my wife. My partner in the small, unglamorous battles of adulthood. The woman who knew exactly how much milk to pour into my coffee without asking. Who used to rest her head against my shoulder during late-night movies even when she fell asleep halfway through. We met young, built a life with the earnest clumsiness of people who believed love alone could solve everything. And for a long time it almost did. Then came routine, exhaustion, the quiet resentment that grows when conversations become logistical and affection is postponed for later. For tomorrow. For when things calm down. And somehow tomorrow never arrives. Still, I believed in us. Not in a dramatic, desperate way, but with the steady faith of a man who shows up every day. Who pays the bills? Reads bedtime stories, fixes leaky faucets, and assumes that loyalty is the silent contract holding everything together. When Emily stepped out of the bedroom and saw me in the hallway, her face changed in a way I will never forget. The way guilt rearranges familiar features into something almost unrecognizable. She did not deny it. She did not scream or cry or throw accusations back at me. She simply closed the door behind her, walked toward the kitchen, and said, in a voice so calm it felt rehearsed, "We need to talk." Those 4 words carried the weight of endings. And I followed her like a man walking into a storm he can already feel on his skin. She told me everything in fragments. As if the truth were too sharp to hold all at once. About a colleague, about feeling invisible, about conversations that started harmlessly and slowly crossed lines neither of them intended to cross. Or so she said. I listened, nodding, asking almost no questions, because while part of me wanted to know every detail, another part knew that some images, once planted in your mind, never leave. What mattered more was not how it happened, but what it meant for our daughter, Lily, who was asleep upstairs, unaware that the architecture of her world was shifting beneath her dreams. That night I did not sleep. I sat in Lily's room instead, watching her breathe, the small rise and fall of her chest grounding me when everything else felt unreal. Parenthood has a way of clarifying priorities with brutal efficiency. Betrayal can break a man, but responsibility rebuilds him, piece by piece, whether he is ready or not. I made a promise to myself there, in the half-light of a night lamp shaped like a crescent moon, that no matter what happened between Emily and me, Lily would grow up feeling safe, loved, and never burdened by the failures of the adults who brought her into this world. The days that followed were heavy with unspoken tension. Emily moved through the house like a guest afraid to overstay her welcome. Careful, quiet, her eyes avoiding mine, while I learned the strange discipline of coexisting with heartbreak. We discussed logistics before emotions. Who would pick Lily up from school? Who would cook dinner? How we would keep routines intact? And only later, when the house was silent again, did the real conversations begin. The ones where voices trembled and truths finally surfaced. She said she didn't know who she was anymore. That motherhood and marriage had swallowed her whole. That the affair made her feel seen again. Desired. Alive. I told her that I had never stopped seeing her. That I simply assumed she knew. And in that gap between assumption and expression, something precious had slipped away. Yet even in my anger, I saw her humanity. Flawed, searching, and that complicated everything. Emily was not a villain in a cheap drama. She was a woman who made a terrible choice while trying to escape a quiet despair she did not know how to name. That understanding did not excuse the pain she caused, but it prevented me from turning our story into something hateful. And for Lily's sake, that restraint mattered. Weeks passed. Then months, marked by counseling sessions, long walks after putting Lily to bed, and difficult decisions that refused to be rushed. I learned to cook better meals, to braid Lily's hair in the mornings, to listen more carefully, not just to words but to silences. Somewhere in the midst of loss, I began to change, not into a colder man, but into a more present one. A father who understood that strength was not measured by endurance alone, but by the courage to face discomfort without letting it poison the future. Emily, too, was changing, confronting the consequences of her actions, standing alone in her own reflection, learning that attention borrowed from secrecy comes at a terrible cost. Whether our paths would converge again or diverge permanently was still uncertain. A question hanging between us like unfinished music. But one truth was already clear. Betrayal had not destroyed me. It had stripped me down. Yes, but in the quiet rebuilding that followed, I was becoming something steadier. Something my daughter could lean on without fear. And perhaps, in time, something that love itself could trust again. The decision about our marriage did not arrive as a single moment of clarity. It unfolded slowly, like dawn creeping into a sleepless room. Each conversation adding a little more light until there was no place left for illusions to hide. Emily and I continued therapy not because we were certain we would stay together, but because we owed each other honesty after years of polite avoidance. And because Lily deserved parents who could speak to one another without bitterness poisoning every word. In those sessions, sitting on opposite ends of a couch that suddenly felt too wide, I learned to articulate anger without cruelty. And Emily learned to listen without defending herself. A skill far more difficult than it sounds when guilt sits heavy in your chest. There were days I wanted to give up, to declare the damage irreparable and walk away with my pride intact. But then I would remember Lily's small hand slipping into mine as we crossed the street. Her absolute trust in my presence. And I knew that whatever choice I made had to model resilience. Not escape at home. Life continued in its ordinary, relentless way. Lunches had to be packed, laundry folded, permission slips signed. Lily began asking questions in the careful tone children use when they sense fragility in the adults around them. Asking why mommy worked late so often. Why daddy looked tired even on weekends. And each answer was a delicate balance between truth and protection. I never spoke badly of Emily. Not even when the hurt surged unexpectedly. Because I understood something fundamental then. My daughter's sense of self was braided from both of us. And to tear one parent down was to weaken the foundation she stood on. That realization became my compass, guiding me through moments when anger threatened to take the wheel. Emily eventually moved into the guest room. A practical decision that carried symbolic weight neither of us could ignore. The physical distance clarified things in a way words could not. Without the familiarity of shared space, we were forced to confront what remained between us when comfort was stripped away. Some nights we talked for hours, revisiting memories, unpacking misunderstandings, acknowledging small wounds that had accumulated unnoticed over the years. Other nights we barely spoke, each lost in our own reflections. And I learned that silence could be either a bridge or a wall depending on how you approached it. I began to notice changes in myself that surprised me. I was more patient with Lily, less distracted by my phone, more intentional about the time we spent together. We started a ritual of evening walks. Just the two of us, circling the neighborhood as she told me about her day in vivid, meandering stories that jumped from playground politics to imaginary worlds only she could see. In those moments, the noise of adult complications faded, replaced by something simpler and purer. And I realized that fatherhood, when embraced fully, could be a source of healing rather than just responsibility. Emily watched these changes quietly at first. Then with something like admiration mixed with regret. One evening, after Lily had gone to bed, she told me she was proud of the father I had become. And the words landed with unexpected force, both affirming and heartbreaking. I thanked her, recognizing that validation from someone who had hurt you can feel complicated. But it also marked a shift in our dynamic. From wounded spouses to two adults acknowledging growth, even if it came at a painful cost. The affair, which had once loomed over every interaction, gradually lost its immediate sting, replaced by a more nuanced understanding of what had broken between us long before another man entered the picture. That clarity did not guarantee reconciliation. But it allowed forgiveness to enter the conversation, not as a favor to Emily, but as a gift to myself. Holding onto resentment had begun to feel like carrying unnecessary weight, and I was learning, step by careful step, how to set it down without forgetting the lessons it taught me. Eventually, the question we had been circling could no longer be postponed. One quiet Sunday afternoon, while Lily was at a friend's birthday party, Emily and I sat at the kitchen table, sunlight stretching across the worn wood between us, and talked about our future with a directness that left no room for ambiguity. We acknowledged that love alone was not enough. That trust, once fractured, required more than good intentions to rebuild, and that sometimes the healthiest choice was not to cling to what had been, but to honor what was becoming. There were tears, but they were softer than before. Tinged with acceptance rather than desperation, we decided to separate, not as enemies, but as partners committed to co-parenting with respect. The decision felt strangely calm, like placing the final piece in a puzzle that had resisted completion for months. Emily would move into an apartment nearby, close enough that Lily's routines would remain intact, close enough that collaboration would be possible without constant friction. We agreed on boundaries, on communication, on shared holidays, and in that careful planning, I felt a sense of control returning. Not over Emily, but over my own life. Telling Lily was the hardest part. We chose a quiet evening, sitting together on the couch, explaining in simple terms that Mommy and Daddy would live in different houses but that our love for her was unchanging and absolute. She listened, brow furrowed, then asked practical questions about her toys, her room, her bedtime stories, and when she realized those anchors would remain, she nodded solemnly, accepting the change with a resilience that humbled me. That night, after she fell asleep, I cried for the first time since the affair came to light. Not from weakness, but from release, from the understanding that grief, when acknowledged, can coexist with hope. In the months that followed, life settled into a new rhythm. My home grew quieter, but also more intentional. I learned to cook for two, to plan my days around shared custody, to fill the empty spaces not with distractions, but with reflection. Emily and I communicated better as co-parents than we had as spouses. Our conversations focused, respectful, free from the old expectations that had once weighed us down. Watching her find her footing independently, I felt a surprising sense of relief, knowing that her happiness no longer depended on my ability to fill every void, and that mine was no longer contingent on salvaging a version of love that no longer fit. Through it all, I discovered that strength was not the absence of pain, but the willingness to transform it into something constructive. I was no longer just surviving betrayal. I was actively shaping a life defined by presence, integrity, and compassion. As a father, I stood taller, not because I had conquered adversity, but because I had allowed it to teach me how to love more consciously, more responsibly, and in that quiet, steady growth, I understood that while my marriage had ended, my capacity for connection had not, and the future, though different from what I once imagined, held the promise of a deeper, more grounded happiness for all three of us. Time, once my enemy, slowly became an ally, not by erasing the past but by placing it at a distance where it no longer dictated my every breath. A year passed in this new arrangement, marked not by dramatic milestones but by a series of small, almost invisible victories that only someone who had been broken would know how to recognize. Lily learned to ride her bike without training wheels, wobbling down the sidewalk while I jogged behind her, heart pounding, ready to catch her and strangely aware that this was how parenthood always felt. Letting go just enough to let them grow while staying close enough to soften the fall. She looked back at me, grinning, pride shining in her eyes. And in that moment I knew that whatever had happened between Emily and me, I was giving my daughter something solid to stand on. Emily and I found a rhythm that surprised us both. Our conversations became efficient, even warm, stripped of old resentments that no longer served us. There were moments of shared laughter during school events. Brief exchanges that hinted at the intimacy we once had. But they no longer carried expectation. Only familiarity. I learned to appreciate Emily as Lily's mother. As a woman navigating her own evolution. Without needing her to be my partner. That shift was subtle but profound. A recalibration of identity that allowed me to reclaim parts of myself I had neglected for years in the quiet weeks when Lily stayed with her mother. I confronted the emptiness I had long avoided. Instead of numbing it with work or noise, I allowed myself to feel it fully. To sit with the silence and ask what I wanted from the next chapter of my life. I started running again, not to punish my body but to remind it of its strength. The steady rhythm of my breath mirroring the slow rebuilding of my confidence. I reconnected with old friends. Rediscovered music I loved before responsibilities crowded it out. And for the first time in a long while, I felt curiosity about the future rather than fear. It was during one of these quieter periods that I met Sarah. There was nothing dramatic about our introduction. No instant spark or cinematic tension. She was a volunteer at Lily's school library. Patient and observant, with a calm presence that seemed to steady the room rather than command it. We spoke casually at first. About books. About children. About the strange way time seems to speed up once you become a parent. She knew I was divorced. Knew I had a child. And she listened without judgment when I mentioned my past. Not probing for details. Not offering unsolicited advice. That respect, more than attraction, was what drew me to her. Our connection unfolded slowly. Intentionally. We met for coffee when Lily was with Emily. Then for long walks where conversation flowed easily. Unburdened by the need to impress. Sarah had her own history. Her own lessons learned. And she approached relationships with a quiet maturity that felt like a balm after the emotional chaos of the previous years. I was cautious, aware of how easily unresolved pain can seep into new beginnings. But I was also honest, sharing my fears, my boundaries, my commitment to being a present father above all else. She accepted this without hesitation. Understanding that loving me meant respecting the life I had built around my daughter. When the time came to introduce Sarah to Lily, I did so carefully, framing her as a friend first, allowing trust to develop organically. Lily, perceptive as ever, observed their interactions with thoughtful curiosity. And when she eventually asked if Sarah was special to me, I answered truthfully, without grand declarations, emphasizing that no matter who entered my life, she would always come first. The reassurance settled something inside her. And watching her laugh with Sarah over shared stories, I felt a cautious optimism take root. Emily noticed the change too. One evening, during a routine exchange of schedules, she asked about Sarah, not with jealousy, but with genuine interest. I told her simply that I was happy. And she smiled, a mix of relief and acceptance in her eyes. Later, she shared that she, too, was finding her way, learning to stand on her own without leaning on anyone else to define her worth. In that mutual acknowledgement, there was closure. Not the dramatic kind, but the quiet certainty that we had both moved forward without denying what we once meant to each other. The true test of my growth came unexpectedly. Lily fell ill one winter night. Feverish and scared, and without hesitation, Emily and I coordinated care seamlessly, sitting together in the emergency room, united by concern rather than conflict. As I watched Emily soothe Lily, I felt gratitude rather than resentment, recognizing that our shared history, however flawed, had produced something profoundly good. Sarah arrived later with warm blankets and calm support. Not intruding, simply present, and in that moment I saw the shape of a future where cooperation, respect, and love could coexist in forms I had never imagined. As the years continued to unfold, I understood that surviving betrayal was never the end goal. It was the beginning of a deeper education in love, responsibility, and self-respect. I had learned to forgive without forgetting, to set boundaries without building walls, to model strength for my daughter not through dominance or denial, but through consistency and compassion. I was no longer defined by what I had lost, but by what I chose to build in its aftermath. And that choice, renewed daily, made all the difference. The final shift did not announce itself with fireworks or declarations. It revealed itself quietly, the way real endings and real beginnings often do. By the absence of fear where it once lived. Lily grew older, taller, her questions sharper, her emotional intelligence expanding in ways that both amazed and challenged me. She began to understand, not just accept, the shape of our family. The fact that love could exist across separate homes without being diluted. That adults could make mistakes without becoming broken. And that strength did not require perfection. Watching her navigate the world with empathy and confidence, I saw the clearest evidence of all that Emily and I had done right after doing something so wrong. Sarah became a steady presence, never forcing her way into Lily's life, always earning her place through patience and consistency. There were nights when the three of us cooked dinner together, music playing softly in the background, Lily narrating every step like a small director convinced the world needed to know her vision. And in those moments, ordinary and unremarkable to an outside observer, I felt a fullness I had once believed was lost forever. Sarah never tried to replace Emily, never competed for a role that wasn't hers. And that quiet respect deepened my love for her in a way intensity never could. Emily, too, continued to evolve. Our conversations shifted from logistics to reflections, sometimes touching gently on the past, not to reopen wounds, but to acknowledge how far we had come. She apologized once more, not dramatically, not in tears, but with a grounded sincerity that told me she had truly understood the weight of her choices. I accepted it without hesitation, realizing that forgiveness, when genuine, feels less like a transaction and more like setting something down that you no longer need to carry. There was no longing left between us, only a shared commitment to the human being we had brought into the world and a quiet respect for the paths we now walked separately. The moment I knew I had fully survived came unexpectedly. On an evening when Lily, now old enough to articulate complex emotions, sat beside me after dinner and said, "I'm glad you and Mom aren't together anymore." Then quickly added, worried she had hurt me. "Not because I didn't want you to be happy, but because you both seem more like yourselves now." Her words landed with a clarity no adult reassurance ever could. I pulled her into a hug, feeling the truth of it settle deep in my chest, understanding that the greatest measure of success after betrayal was not reconciliation or revenge, but the emotional health of the child watching everything unfold. Years later, standing at Lily's school graduation, I felt the full arc of our story come into focus. Emily stood nearby, composed and confident. Sarah's hand rested lightly in mine, and Lily moved between us effortlessly, secure in the knowledge that she was supported from all sides. There was no tension, no unspoken grief lingering in the air, only pride and a shared history that had been transformed rather than denied. I caught Emily's eye across the crowd, and we exchanged a small nod. An acknowledgement of everything we had survived and everything we had learned. I realized then that betrayal had not been the defining chapter of my life. Fatherhood had. The pain I once thought would ruin me had instead refined me, teaching me how to love with boundaries, how to listen without defensiveness, how to remain open without abandoning myself. I had become a stronger father not because I endured suffering in silence, but because I allowed it to reshape me into a man who chose presence over pride, growth over stagnation, and compassion over control. As the sun dipped low and the crowd dispersed, Lily walked between Sarah and me, talking excitedly about her plans, her dreams stretching wide and unburdened, and I felt an overwhelming gratitude for the journey that led us here. Imperfect, painful, and profoundly human, I had survived my wife's betrayal. Yes, but more importantly, I had built a life rooted in dignity, resilience, and love, and in doing so, I had given my daughter the greatest inheritance I could offer. A living example that even after everything falls apart, it is still possible to stand back up, choose wisely, and create a future that feels whole. In the end, there was no dramatic victory, no moment where the past was erased or rewritten, only a quiet certainty that settled into my bones as naturally as breath. I stood in my kitchen one ordinary morning, sunlight spilling across the floor, listening to Lily laugh from the other room, and I understood that this was what healing looked like when it was real. Not loud, not desperate, just steady and honest. My life was no longer built around what had been taken from me, but around what I had chosen to protect and grow. I did not lose my family, it transformed. And in that transformation, I found a version of myself I respected. I had learned that love does not always mean staying, that forgiveness does not require forgetting, and that strength is not proven by how much pain you can endure, but by how gently you carry it forward. I survived my wife's betrayal. Yes, but more than that, I became a father my child could look up to without fear. A man who held his head high without bitterness. And someone who knew, with quiet confidence, that even after everything breaks, a life rebuilt with dignity can still feel deeply, undeniably whole. That's the end of today's story. If you enjoyed it, please leave a comment with your thoughts, like the video, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you.